Alrighty. Welcome to Friday Forum. Today is November 14th, 2025. This is the 234th Friday Forum in this series. The series is hosted by ICLR, the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. We're Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Our mission is to make Canada more resilient to natural disasters, and each month we present recent research related to that mission. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. I'm speaking to you from London, Ontario. This place is on traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Ottawandaron nations. Last time, CAL FIRE Deputy Director Frank Bigelow told us about new building code provisions to reduce wildland-urban interface fires in California and some associated hazard maps. If you missed it, you can watch the recording. You can find the video, our speaker's deck, and transcript at www.iclr.org/workshops. And you can find all our other Friday Fora there too. In next month's Friday Forum, ICLR's Director of Research, Dan Sandink, is going to brief us on the outcomes of the Resilient Homes Task Force. The task force convened builders and insurers to produce our good, better, best checklists of above code design. That's going to be on Friday, December 12th, 2025. Today, I'm very pleased to bring you UC Berkeley professor Michael Gollner. Dr. Gollner is going to tell us about computer modeling of wildland-urban interface fires. And here's why I think you might care about his talk. Mathematical fire models have been around at least since 1960, and today's models are very sophisticated by contrast. They account for weather and fuel and topography. Some of them deal with firefighting resources and other factors. But as near as I can tell, current models fall into two separate groups. One group deals with structures and the others with wildlands. And that's a problem for people who care about fire in the wildland-urban interface, which involves both. If you can't model both, you can't make good probabilistic predictions about how well some community is going to fare in a future wildfire, or about the risk to this house versus that house inside the wildland-urban interface, at least not to the level that pricing actuaries might want. I asked Dr. Gollner to speak today because he may have brought us to a hinge point in WUI fire modeling. He has a model that handles both. And I'm going to let him tell you about that in just a moment. But before our speaker begins, here's our agenda. Our webinar will last 90 minutes. Our speaker will present for 30 or 40 minutes, about half that time. Then I'm going to moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A box. I will try to pose your questions in the order that they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first question, then I'll move on to others, then I'll circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded, and ICLR will post our speakers' slides and a link to the video in the next day or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. You can find the video and the slides and so on at www.iclr.org/workshops. And now I'm going to turn it over to Professor Gollner. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you so much, Keith. I'm glad to be here. Glad we finally organized the time. I've been wanting to present to this audience for quite a while. So the talk title today is Loss Modeling of Wildland-Urban Interface Fires. But the talk that I want to give today, I'm actually going to focus on three parts. So I want to start actually with some more recent work that came out in Nature Communications that focuses on, it incorporates our modeling of wildland-urban interface fires, but it puts it together with data to understand what features are most important that contribute to loss based on large-scale studies in California. Followed by a little deep dive into some of the modeling, and then just a quick preview of some of the work that's ongoing and what will be coming up in the future that is very relevant and is essentially, will tie in to improve the model, because there's always tons of additional work to do. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So first, shameless plug, the Berkely Fire Research Lab. There's about 13 students and postdocs here who work on a mix of fire modeling and experimental fire research. What you're all here today to talk about more on our modeling and experimental side for WUI. We work on WUI fire spread modeling and tools. The goal to use that for risk analysis for communities and modeling to understand fire behavior, including some AI and ML analysis. But a lot of our research is all tied into understanding the structure-to-structure spread, the embers, ornamental vegetation in Zone 0, and putting that together between models, lab experiments, and field experiments. Then we also do other things. We have a smoke generation apparatus, and we do a lot of work on fire emissions and health effects, as well as fire safety in the built environment, but weird built environments, things like, solar farms and spacecraft fire safety. So we actually just finished an experiment on the space station. So there's quite a breadth, but it all uses the same fundamental concepts put together. And I hope this will be of interest today. So we're talking about WUI fires, wildland-urban interface. And obviously, I don't have, well, not obviously, but I don't have Canadian data. But looking in California and in the US, the losses are growing, and they're growing dramatically and tremendously. There are primarily a small number of very large loss events that are dominating the structures burned. It's not the small fires that are burning some, tens to hundreds. It's the thousands and more that are dominating the map. And it's not just in California. The Marshall Fire was in Colorado, Lahaina in Hawaii. These keep happening and are really challenging our notion of where fire risk is located, as well as what we do to try to lower this risk. When the Palisades burned in Los Angeles, this was an area near Malibu that is consistently burning, these downwinds. But I don't think in our recent memory we thought of Altadena, even though it's at the base of the mountains here, being at the highest risk. We might have thought that for, on the bottom right, the Camp Fire in 2018, which burned through this wooded community and this was incredibly devastating. I mean, all of these are devastating. But it makes us question where this risk is. And modeling these WUI fires is really a huge challenge. And I give you an example. This is Coffey Park from Santa Rosa during the Tubbs Fire. And you can see how the fires burned one side and stopped and didn't burn the other. And there's an awful lot of questions that go into that, right? You see green grass in the yards, but you see buildings burned down, nothing on the other side, and what happened. And there's so much work from investigation and modeling and other pieces that come together. But we're hoping to talk a little bit about today how we contribute to some of that knowledge and what's still ongoing. So before I do this, I have to talk about some of the pathways to fire spread and give some idea of the mitigation measures we're going to discuss. First off, back in the day, radiation was thought to be responsible really for most or all of the ignitions in wildland-urban interface fires. You have a large fire, you have a separation. That separation and the size of the flames would basically dominate the calculation, going back to like Jack Cohen's SIAM model of either structure-to-structure spread or from the forest to the wildland-urban interface. Though we found that's usually not the case. It takes an incredible amount of heat and the flames have to be fairly close. And if you have appropriate defensible space, you don't have radiation exposure to a structure. The next is direct flame contact. And now you hear the concept so much of connected fuels coming from IBHS, CUL, and other studies. These connected fuels, which also ICLR had a wonderful series of diagrams from the Fort McMurray investigation. You get one, say it's a grass fire coming in, then it hits the fence, then it hits the side of the house. Depending on how the fuels are connected, so long as the fire can continue to propagate, small flames up close to a structure can cause that destruction. And that's why in California they're calling it Zone 0, but we've always said that space right next to the house to be devoid of any flammable materials because small flames close to the house can still give a high heat impact. Finally, embers or firebrands. So these small, typically smoldering particles eventually ignite, sometimes hours after the rest of the flames are gone, and they transport very far ahead. And as you can see here, Jack always called this a blizzard of embers, but essentially they're everywhere, and you're just looking for the receptive fuels and the right conditions where they can ignite. Now, most of the fires that occur in the wildland-urban interface tend to be from embers. But that doesn't mean embers are the only way they spread. But it tends to be, I think when you look at the investigations, embers bring that wildland into the urban area. And then embers jump across the block, but direct flame contact and radiation may be more responsible of spreading it within and along that block. So there's really a combination of factors and all must be accounted for. Now, how do you prevent this? Well, there are many different mitigation approaches, but I want to highlight the two main types. One is sort of the defensible space type. So it's locally trying to reduce the exposure. You can do broader work, of course, to reduce fire exposure. But in general, you're trying to keep the flames away from the house, reduce the number of embers generated. And that means adjacent to the house, no flammable materials. Going back to some zone, having very spaced fuels and nothing super flammable. And then extended, just lowering the flames so you don't have an active flame front. So that's the exposure that you can reduce. On the other side, you can harden. Talking about preventing embers from entering through vents. Working on your eaves so that they can't catch from flames or from embers. Removing mulch and flammable materials away from the very base or fences. Hardening your gutters or removing them, looking at decks. So all the things that can collect embers to ignite or get flames. So you want to basically reduce the exposure, increase hardening. And unfortunately, one open system can allow the fire to move straight in. So we have to be very cautious about how we do this to actually try to prevent flames from coming in. So now to the crux of the talk. So part one, I want to talk about a data-driven approach to looking at WUI risk. And we know that mitigation must be applied, right? And we need methods to relate these features and exposures to losses. Past analyses never truly rank the mitigation measures, and there's no quantitative data. This has always been a struggle. What do you do first? How effective is one versus another? And to do that at large scale, I think of it a lot in terms of like health studies. You need that large scale study. Is taking this medicine or doing this actually practically in real life going to have an impact? Now, there's been some studies of this, and a lot of them are focused on individual fires. They're focused on linear correlations or statistics. So one parameter to another parameter, and there's no exposure data from fire and embers. And that's what we want to try to add to this discussion. So to do this, we have to get a data set. So we use a damage inspection data set from CAL FIRE, DINS, and that's our ground truth. And so you can see on the right, there's a lot of structures that have burned in California, incredible amount. And we try to pick them from a variety of different fires. Fires through wooded areas, fires through, Southern California chaparral, as well as Northern California kind of oak scrub. So different community density and different fire conditions. And then we're going to look at the significance of different features as well as the impact of hardening and defensible space on the outcomes. So this is an idea of the DINS data set. It's a really extensive data set covering fires across the state. You can obviously see the areas which are most susceptible to fire because those are where the WUI fires have occurred. And we, from this, pick out 5 major fires. And why only 5? Well, they have this breadth, and because there's a lot of individual work that must be done on each fire. So that's why we chose these specific areas. So we combined data. We took the DINS, which also includes a lot of features, the roof, the siding, the windows, the vent, eaves, etc., as well as the year built. And then we had to add a lot of missing data. So defensible space was not originally included. So we have to go back to LiDAR data, particularly for Sonoma County, before the fire, and we're lucky to have 1 meter resolution data to look at where vegetation was. We don't get the very fine scale, like on the ground mulch, but we are able to see vegetation. We can also supplement this with aerial and street view imagery and a lot of undergraduate hours. We also looked at separation between structures. We have the footprint of every structure, and we can calculate how far apart structures are. An interesting thing we add, and I'll talk about more later, is that we never actually know how the fire impacted these structures. So what we did is we reconstructed the fires. We ran the models with vegetation and limited urban spread models, a very simple one, and then I'll talk about a more complex one. And we extracted the fire intensity, which is akin to the flame length, and the ember cast. And so that gave us a relative model of some kind of approximate flame and ember exposure to each structure. And then, of course, we had to add a lot of undamaged structures. Newer accounts took a lot of data around from undamaged structures because what's most important is comparing what burned and what didn't burn. And so there's lots of missing information, and we had to slowly and manually or through other methods add back that information so we had a complete data set. And then we just basically had to do validation. So we knew where the fire was, we had the STINs, and we had to work the data as much as possible. So I'm going to talk about first where we look at defensible space. So this is one thing that was sort of new in the data set is we tried to use both the imagery as well as LiDAR to understand whether vegetation was next to a structure. So defensible space is this buffer we have surrounding structures, and using the 1 meter LiDAR, we could actually get down to the point that we could see whether something was in that 5 foot zone, because it's about 3 feet. So not accounting for the very lowest surface fuels, but this gave us a good idea of vegetation. You can see on the right-hand side what that vegetation looks like in green, and the left-hand side just the building marks. So you can actually see where we're actually looking at the boundaries, sort of the outer walls of the building. And next to that, we're overlaying the vegetation layer. So this allows us to very easily see whether a significant amount of vegetation is within that building footprint. Now, for the fire modeling part, we already know these fires that have burned. In this case, we're using a wildfire model called Elm Fire, which I'm going to talk a lot more about as we go on. But we put the vegetation, the weather, and the topography specifically for this past fire, and we can model the wildland fire. Now, the biggest issue is that when you're doing this, we don't know the structure-to-structure spread. So this is the base model without anything for wildland-urban interface, using the base land fire fuels on the right. You can see the campfire and how it did not spread through the community because urban areas are marked as unburnable. And there's so much urban area that it's marked completely unburnable. So this is a problem and is a limitation. And that's one of the reasons why we've been working on a wildland-urban interface model. Now, for the purpose of this work, we didn't want to bias the results. We use a very simplistic urban model. It's based on the Hamada model, which is a post-earthquake, but essentially it gives it sort of a fluid path that allows it to spread through. Now, the model reconstruction is never perfect. There are suppression actions, there's changes on the ground. You can see the north spread in particular goes a little off, but in general, the exposure is very close to what's happening in the fire, and it's corrected to fit for the fire lines and time that we have. Now you can see that this is showing fire progression. Obviously, there's more destruction to the right. So this is we only get a perimeter at a particular time, right? So we're trying to match these times as best we can. But this gives us a good idea of which areas had higher or lower exposure. We only really have this map, and we had one Landsat 8 image on the left-hand side during this fire. It is interesting here. You can see just the significance of spotting, which is a really stochastic process. It's hard to model because every run is going to be a little bit different. And so the way this is done is by doing many runs and averaging them. So once we have all of this data, we want to actually look at how important is any feature. So typically we have like a linear statistical method. We say, okay, this spacing, well, how much is destroyed based on spacing? But we can attempt to fit the data to many parameters at once using machine learning. So we use regression and classification methods and try to extract the importance of the features. So first we had to clean and pre-process the data. We used imputation to look at the missing values, and we standardized the numerical values and encoded categorical variables. Don't worry about the specifics, but essentially we looked at many different models. We narrowed down on 4 models, starting with the logistic regression, which is like a linear model, and that's the existing best practice, and then looked at a variety of different machine learning models. In the end, we use something called XGBoost, and it's just one of the machine learning methods we use to do this multidimensional thing. We also then wanted to look at, well, what feature in this fit model is most important? And we did this for all the different models. So we see the trends are pretty consistent because you don't want there to be something artificially shown. So let's see what that contribution looks like. This is a stacked WUI data from all of the 5 fires we looked at and looking at the relative importance of each of these variables. And, to no surprise, the spacing between structures is the most significant variable. And this makes sense. Houses that burn are most correlated to the neighboring houses, right? You don't see a large loss fire from isolated structures. You always see that from structures that are clumped and grouped together. It's also interesting to see the siding played a major role. Each individual fire, sometimes the trends are slightly different because individual fires have different building construction and different trends. But overall, siding and year built are very important. Now, year built is a challenge because it's what we call a confounding variable. Year built will influence the siding and will influence the way things are built. But also, if we don't include year built, you don't incorporate the nuances of the age of the structure changes how many cracks and the care of the structure. The year of the structure changes the design of the building. So year built is still important and has to be included because it's a very strongly correlated variable. Unless we got really, really detailed information about houses, which we don't at this time. But then flame length and embers are also important. Other natural disasters, say, hurricanes or floods, for floods, the main correlation is with the height of the water. With a hurricane, it's going to be the wind speed. But here, actually, the exposure is not the first correlating variable. It's up there, but it is not the most important. And then all the other things matter. The roof construction, vent screen, vegetation separation is the defensible space. We'll break that up in a little bit, and that'll be interesting. And window panes and eaves. So they're all important, but you see that some have a stronger influence on the outcome than others in the model. Just as an example, breaking up the Tubbs fire versus the Thomas fire. Thomas fire is in SoCal, Tubbs fire up here in Northern California. In the Tubbs fire, actually, flame length was more important or as important as structure separation. Why? Well, that depends. In the Tubbs fire, it went through a fairly rural area and then into several suburban communities. So probably having the fire actually getting close to these structures played a big role in more communities than it did in others. I mean, also in the Thomas fire, it was the second most, but structure separation was even stronger. And so it all depends because this is only saying, if all the structures have the same separation, that won't be an important variable. So that's why it's important to have a very wide data set. But in the Tubbs fire, embers deposited have a very strong influence, and also in the Thomas. So you can see how the variations change a bit, though the same culprits are still there. Now, we did another analysis, which I found really interesting. Once we had this, we essentially built a model, and it was about 82% accurate in predicting whether a structure was lost after a fire. So this is not a replacement for fire modeling. This is used, in a post-analysis sort of looking at this. And it's interesting based on those features that you could get that. Well, if we already have that, we said, why don't we just take that and reapply? What if we took all the buildings there in California from all these fires, and we said, what if we added some mitigation and different amounts? How could that have changed the outcome based solely on this model? So it doesn't incorporate the effect of how it would change the spread or anything else, but just on a base with the same exposure. So the very bottom, it shows no mitigation. The original data set that we're looking at for this exercise is 20% survived and 80% destroyed. If we move to hardening alone, and we harden those buildings, we only bring it up by 5% to 25%. But remember, that's not changing defensible space or exposure. If we only do the zone 0, so if we only change the removal of fuel in the 5 feet, just like almost a little more than 1 meter around structures, we actually go from 20% surviving to 37%. It was a much higher jump than I had expected. But when you think about it, maybe it is to be expected. Hardening is not going to have a very dramatic impact until you remove adjacent fuels, right? Those would overpower almost any kind of reduction that you apply. From there, you see hardening in zone 0 having an impact, and hardening in zone 0-1 up to 48% survival having a very large impact. So even without moving structures, you see that you can go from 20 to 48% survival. Now, I've heard some, well, only half surviving, it doesn't matter, but this is not incorporating the fact, well, I mean, to begin with, these are very close structures in certain communities. Those that burned down were particularly close. But also, it doesn't incorporate the fact that the fires are moving, and if there aren't as many receptive homes for them to spread to, it's going to slow down. Fire service will now have an ability to slow it, but also it will just slowly move less and ignite less structures before the wind dies out. So there's really a dynamic spread and change that needs to be modeled in the future. But on the base layer from these statistics, we see really strong trends. And I think out of this, what we're really seeing is that there is an impact for all the mitigation measures that we are proposing. And I think that's important. I think we've been waiting to really show that there is such an impact that we need, that there is such an impact on all the data from structures, that adding mitigation measures to older structures can actually make a big difference. So I think most of you are here today to talk and to listen to about the WUI model. So we call this wildland-urban an extension. As Keith mentioned, and maybe giving too much credit, right? Our goal was to take existing wildland models and add to it wildland-urban interface. Now, the current framework for any kind of wildland fire model, you take the fuels, which are all wildland, weather topography, you put them together with a surface fire, crown fire, spotting, and you put it all together. Now, to add to this, we have to add fuels in the built environment. So we replace those non-burnable fuels with burnable fuels. But we don't just make them a different wildland. We actually have to run a completely different equation because the way structures burn is different. The mechanisms, it's not a Rothermel determining a spread rate. Instead, we look at direct flame contact, radiation, and spotting by firebrands. Now, the spotting by firebrands is similar. It's just modulated by the heat release of the building. But otherwise, the direct flame contact and the radiation are somewhat different and have to be calculated. Buildings actually spread way slower than a wildland fire, right? It takes a while for the fire to get seeded, for it to move through the building, but it generates a lot of heat and it burns for a lot longer on a structure than it does as a spreading wildland fire. So that's why we really have to use different equations and different cells. We put that into a modeling tool. And one of the interesting things is that it puts out the rate of spread and the heat flux and the ember cast. So this is another way to look at it. And Dwi Pronomo was a postdoc here who developed this model along with the rest of our team. So wildland fire spread on the left is already happening. That's the wildland default model in Elm Fire. But we also have wildland to urban, right? The wildfire can ignite urban cells. But then the urban cells can go back and light wildland cells. Or the urban cells can light other urban cells by either pathway, either a combination of flame contact and radiation or firebrands. And that's very important to distinguish these different modes. And then this allows us to take a fire, for instance, where we have a very intermixed community and the fire spreads to wildland, spreads up to a structure, structure to structure, structure to structure, back to wildland, back to structure. That kind of hopscotch spread is actually what we observe in a WUI fire. And so it's important that it's programmed that way. So how does this work? I'm not going to go through all of it. I'm going to do a real quick shot. But we have radiation to some radius and direct flame contact to a smaller radius. These radii have to be constrained computationally. DFC is the direct flame contact. And so the direct flame contact and radiation are calculated by simple equations that are fit based upon the heat release rate. So in the first simulation, so now we have discretized and done more, but from this paper cited in 2024, we use constant properties for all the structures, and we calculate the flame contact and the radiation coming out to the surrounding structures or to the surrounding wildland cells. The big difference here really was a method to connect wildland and the urban spread. The urban spreads structure to structure. The wildland has this front. And the connection really is about heat flux and spreading time. And so that relationship allows us to link the models. This is very simplified, and I'll talk about new experiments, which for the first time provide some of that heating data. And we'll see we'll probably be completely modifying this based on, for the first time, validation data at this scale. Now, the embers are spread, as you see those larger black lines, as a log normal sort of function. In other words, the probability of embers being at any point decrease with time. There's actually a more physical model for ember transport, and frankly, it doesn't work very well, not in practice. This statistical approach, though, works very well and matches fires much better. There's no validation data for embers, but when we combine it all, you can look at the entire fire. And so the log normal and normal functions allow us to look at the distribution because there's different probabilities that the ember is going to fall. And it's basically all coming from a fit from numerical simulations that were done in CFD. Now, just as an example of the outputs, because I already showed you the campfire before, what can you extract from that? And again, this is for fuels that are all consistent. So it's not, we do have that now where, structures have different properties. But in this case, for the Thomas fire, take a look here. At first, you see the time of arrival. So it's spreading the wildland fire, and it's spotting. You can see it picks up some of the jumps. It also burns some cells that it shouldn't. But remember, this is an approximation because anything you do is an ensemble. So out of 100 or hundreds of runs, you then average the results from many different because spotting is always probabilistic. You can then look at the ember cast, which you see, of course, embers are spread throughout the area that was burned and go in the direction of wind, and looks pretty reasonable and realistic. Going back to the components, we're breaking up direct flame contact versus radiation. And it's interesting to not only see the areas exposed to it, but also the levels of direct flame contact versus radiation. Direct flame contact has incredibly high levels because it's a very, very local process. Now, there are issues with this, right? Because we only have 30 meter resolution of fuels and structures at this point. But the direct flame contact, we're talking about flames next to structures, and so we'll see high heat fluxes. And then radiation on the bottom. And I think these radiation heat fluxes are similar-ish to what we observe in new experiments. So what are some of the capabilities? At first, I was showing the existing Hamada model, and probably that's the general idea of how modeling is done in any coupled sense for a lot of the catastrophe models that exist. They can provide time of arrival outputs and ember cast and fireline intensity. However, it's not actually connected to structural property variations or information, right? If you're just incorporating and saying, okay, this is a burning area, it's still moving as a front. And so here we do the same thing, but we have the ability to change property values. So we can look at cells, we can go finer, and we can do that. We can also look at the resultant fire intensity, the resultant heat flux, and try to understand which processes are driving, depending on changing scenarios. And there's a physical framework for improvement. As I mentioned, we're getting values for heat flux, but only now, after this model was built, have we actually received some of that information from real experiments. So now we can go back and try to tune the model to be more realistic and actually do a better job of incorporating the influence of wind realistically and the flow patterns between buildings, and continue to improve that with time. So I'm going to talk about the conclusions overall, and then I want to talk about some of the ongoing work. So first off, some of the big factors that are leading to building destruction is the separation distance. We know that building arrangement is incredibly important to fire spread. Embers are first to get in there, wide areas impacted by embers. But eventually, structure separation and the structure-to-structure spread dominates. Flame length is still important and plays a critical role. It's talking about the intensity of the flames up to it. And in our model, higher intensity fires with higher flame length loft more embers. And I think that's probably realistic in real fires. Now, building features and home hardening are important, right? We do see that siding particularly played an important role in this data, more so than other factors. But defensible space was very practically relevant. In fact, we saw particularly the zone 0, so the closest area of vegetation, played a really critical role in mitigation, right? It's very to be cautious, the structure separation distance was the most important variable overall, right? If you spread out, and I think we all accept that, if you give more structure separation, we're going to see a bigger drop in losses. However, you can't pick up and move buildings like Legos. So applying this realistically, we saw that the easiest thing to do that actually paid big dividends in losses for existing homes would actually be to remove vegetation closest to the house. And then we would get to all these other factors that play an important role. So I think we still have some questions. The year built was a real confounding variable. That structure parcel information is kind of a confounding variable until we get more information about it. And the new WUI model, which we've improved upon from previous work, really, it starts providing fire intensity outputs and flexible structural properties and can actually take fires from wildland into urban and has a framework that's built in for us to use it. So one thing to note, the code is open, Wildfire. It's part of the Pyrogens project as well. So if you use Pyrocast, you can actually look at fire spread that does not have WUI now because the WUI data is not there, that we're working on putting out a data set for all of California. But I think really important in terms of outputs from this is that the structure is there and the framework for us to keep improving and actually link wildland and WUI spread. So I keep mentioning experiments and what's going on. I can't help but give some preview. So we completed this summer experiments that were led by IBHS at their facility in South Carolina. We were invited actually as part of two projects. One, we actually connected with a group here with Alan Goldstein, who's a atmospheric scientist, atmospheric chemist. And you can see on the top left where the arrow is, there's a little drone flying. So we captured emissions from these burns. On the right-hand side is an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit. So the 900 square foot house next to a larger full-size structure. And on the right-hand side, what you can't see is a giant wall of wind. And it's just an amazing experience to be able to use this facility and actually get real fire exposure data from a burning structure to another structure. You can see the firefighters putting out embers on the grass over there. We collected embers. We collected smoke, which we then also corroborated by burning everything in the lab so we know where it's coming from. And finally, we have heat fluxes. So IBHS designed these experiments sponsored by CAL FIRE to look at the heat fluxes from buildings and did an immense amount of work to try to characterize the heating from different burning buildings. That heating data will really help us tune this model and make it more realistic. From 30-mile-an-hour winds, which you see here, to 55-mile-an-hour winds are some dramatic differences. And we hope to build out an empirical model as based as the physics as well as real data that's going to take us from this complete empiricism that we're at today to actually connecting this to real data to really get into the details of what's happening in structure loss. And finally, I just want to mention, because this local area came up so importantly, California is in this process of trying to impose regulations of plants adjacent to structures, ornamental vegetation. So this has become a really big issue. And I would say we got more than drawn, sucked, pulled, yanked into this question. And eventually with Berkely Fire Department, so we partnered with the local fire department, who passed their own ordinance called the Ember proposal to restrict vegetation adjacent to houses. But in doing that, there's obviously a lot of public outcry and a lot of questions. And so we ran some very first basic tests looking at this. So this was using a plant, Pisporum tenaphilium or cohuhu, which is basically a common foundation or hedge shrub. Actually comes from New Zealand originally. But we tried to test a healthy, well-hydrated plant, so about 168% live fuel moisture content, to a stressed dry plant, so 65% live fuel moisture content. That's still a lot of water, and it looks green. It's still a flexible leaf, but it's pretty dried. And then we sealed this box so that they could not catch embers. Just looking at fire exposure. And we gave it some very limited fire exposure, not to the level that we saw at IBHS, but something getting close to it. What you again can't see on the left-hand side is a row of fans. In this case, they're firefighting fans. And on the left-hand side, you see a dry plant test, and on the right, a well-irrigated. And sorry, they may not be perfectly synced in time. But what you'll see is they both ignite around 2 minutes following ignition. The way the dry plants burn is different, right? There are obviously more risk, and we see a lot more heat flux come from them because they all burn at once. But even the wet plants still burn considerably. Now, I know you say, well, that fire is actually kind of close. It is, because we're trying to mimic what if you had structures that were apart. It could be 20 or 30 feet apart with a large structure with a very high wind, or it could be mimicking, there's data for 10-foot separation of structures with almost no wind. And so they're not exactly, a perfect set. This is an initial case. But what we tried to look at based on the data was, again, instrumenting heat fluxes. And does the wet vegetation, what influence does it have? And when we look up at the top, at the eaves, we don't actually see a large difference. We actually see that whether the plant's kind of wet, dry, or no plant at all, we generally see somewhat similar heat fluxes. Obviously, using a pallet source is not the most constant. But as we get lower in the wall, there's a somewhat reduced heat flux for a period of time. However, that is taken over at the point the plants ignite. And so really what we're seeing is that unless the plants are going all the way to the eaves, they're not helping in any way. But they are introducing risk, because eventually even a very wet plant, if there's any structures nearby, can eventually dry out and ignite themselves. And so, again, it's just a single species because there's a limited amount we can do in 3 days and we can look at. But I think even at these low conditions of 15-mile-an-hour winds with the heating, we see there's still ignition and still posing risks. And so this just goes and really corresponds to some of the data that we had, which show that removing vegetation near the structure is important. We're not talking about, everything, but at least for this particular case, we do see there's still risks. I don't want to talk about the comparison so much, but I will say IBHS and many others are continuing to do a lot of data. Before I end, I want to do a big thank you. Obviously, this work was done by a number of really talented individuals. Miriam led the DINS analysis that was in Nature Communications. WUI led the development of the WUI model. Daniel, Maria, Yiran, and many others contributed from the lab. Also, collaborators Arnaud and Ali from University of Maryland, and Chris Lautenberger, who's the original Elm Fire developer from Cloudfire. And then for those recent Zone Zero experiments, Wuchan and Mitchell are postdocs here at Berkeley running those. And we partnered with the Berkeley Fire Department. Dave Winokur kind of led that charge. And then we partnered with UCANR, with Yana, Jesse, and Bruno on the vegetation. So I just want to thank you all for your attention. I don't want to leave too much time just on the presentation, so hopefully we have a lot of discussion left over.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. This was a wonderful talk. We do have a lot of time left for conversation. We have one question in the Q&A, but I want to ask mine first because I came up with mine first. On your slide 23. That's the one with the bar chart showing the effectiveness of hardening versus zone zero versus et cetera, et cetera. It's nice to see a reduction from 75% of buildings igniting to 50% igniting. And my question is 1/3 reduction in loss the best we can do? Is that going to be enough for, 80% down to 50%? So it's that same order of magnitude. Is that going to be enough for insurers to say, okay, we're going to stay in the market and we're going to keep insuring people? And the thing that sort of really prompts my question about this is the National Research Council of Canada proposed in the recent National Wildfire Guide hardening that goes beyond what I think you're talking about here. They suggested hardening up to what they're calling non-combustible construction class 1, fire resistant 1, that has a 1 hour fire rating, meaning you can put a fire next to the wall and it burn for an hour before it ignites the wood behind the fire. So okay, so part A of
so
my
let me address.
Am I getting that right? Please, thanks.
Yeah, in two parts. First on the hardening part, and actually I'll come back to this. But on those recent experiments, right? That wall you see is made of plywood and 2x4s, but in front of it is hardy board. It's cement board. Yeah. And while we had to retape, that cement board went through 14 something tests with great fire exposures, and it survived just fine. So yeah, having no windows, no gaps, perfectly sealed cement covered walls is very effective, so long as no embers slip in, right? There are many other vulnerabilities. Sometimes it happens on a siding plain wall. Most of the time it happens at intersections, or the windows fall out, or other factors like that, or the eaves. But yeah, if everything is covered up, I think there is a much stronger fire prevention. There's basically an incredible fire prevention layer that is not in any of these homes we're looking at, right? So I want to caution that, going then to the second question of, well, we can only get a 50% reduction. So think of it like a medical study, right? You have something that in the lab is 100% effective, and then you do it in real life and it's only 50% effective. Why? Well, people don't follow all the rules. People don't do this. The data is not perfect. There are many reasons. So I look at this and I feel really happy and confident that we see strong signals. This is showing that there's clearly correlation and that it's having an impact. These predictions are not in any way perfect because they're not dynamic, and they're only incorporating the amount of zone zero that we would have detected based on the remote sensing, right? It's not actually going there and checking that the mulch is removed.
Sorry,
and the fences.
let me interrupt you for just a second, Michael. Maybe it's my end, maybe it's at yours, but for the last 30 seconds or so, your audio has been cutting out. Is anybody else experiencing the same thing, or is this just me?
I'm hearing you pretty garbled too.
Okay, so I think we need a third party to say, is it at my end or is it at Michael's end?
Is anyone hearing me garbled right now? Is this garbled?
My voice is broken. Okay, so apparently the problem is at my end. I'm just going to turn off my video too.
Okay, so I'm okay. Hopefully.
You're okay.
Yeah. All right. So
sorry.
Yeah. But I can get to that question. I will, the mitigation factors here and how they're applied, this is assuming the way it is on the ground, right? So we're seeing for zone zero and for defensible space that the vegetation, the bulk of the vegetation is not there. We don't know exact surface cover. For hardening, that's not an inspection of checking that's saying there's vents, but is that really applied right? Is it done right? I think there's a big difference between an on-the-ground inspection and making sure things are truly implemented as they should be versus what we have done from these large-scale remote observations. But still, at a population level, seeing these trends, I think, is really powerful. To dig into the actual impacts, to dig into how much hardening truly has to be done to really turn the tide, I think will require more data on the ground and more advanced modeling with time.
And I assume that's in your research agenda?
Of course, it's in the research agenda. I would say, of course, it takes a large team, not just here, but obviously IBHS is working a lot of this. NIST has long history. ULFSRI is doing lots of investigations and work. And there are many other researchers who are looking at some of these issues. So I think the field is small based on the size of the problem, and it should expand. But there's definitely a lot of people looking at this, and it needs to continue. And I think as we push this, because it's involved a lot of the California insurance changes too, and how we're looking at regulating models and trying to make changes into the system, we need to understand the impact of mitigation. And it is really hard and complicated to do that quantitatively. But insurers are forced to do that here, and they all do it a little differently. And I think the more we keep improving it, the more confidence we can have to give good credit for work. But it's a complicated problem. So much of the influence comes from your neighbor. So, these numbers assume your neighbors are doing the work too. So that is hard.
Right. Okay, let me turn to, I hope that my audio is being okay. I'm going to speak more slowly so that we've got a better chance of being understood. But Skyler asked, can you speak more to the issue of vegetation separation distance? In the recent Nature Communications paper, from my reading, it looks like that variable is simply characterized by the first zone in which vegetation is present. However, this does not discriminate between a home with vegetation only in zone 0 versus ones with vegetation in zone 0, 1, 2, and 3, or any other combination. Intuitively, I would expect these to be very different conditions with potentially different outcomes.
Yeah, so a little bit of it was garbled, but I think basically we're talking about how this vegetation separation distance was calculated. In the work, we have a complete picture basically of the vegetation around the structure. So we have both a distance and then we have a binning of, is there anything within this? Is there anything within this? And is there anything within this? And so those are the three zones we look at. Obviously, you see most of these have vegetation in a lot of the zones, and there are fewer that do not, but it's pretty dramatic when they do not. It doesn't then take into account of the tree limbs, what's limbed, what's that. There are finer scale details, but we do see a very strong correlation when things are very cleared. We see a really big impact. Does that help answer?
Yeah, I think so. Next question is from Yujun Yin, who asks, one takeaway is that structure separation distance is a primary factor, as you pointed out. Based on your study, would you comment on the safe structure separation distance, beyond which a structure's vulnerability against wildfire becomes more dictated by flame length and radiant heat?
Yes. Yeah. I do not think that this study is capable of giving the safe separation distance based on the results. However, I think that some of the experiments at IBHS does a better job of giving that picture. And I think the results that will come out show that, when you talk about, and in roughness, right, 30 to 40 feet is a reasonable distance it's going to depend on the conditions and what's in between and how high the wind speed is of dramatically reducing risk. And the closer you get, the more important the building material choice becomes, right? As you get to, 20 feet, you get a stronger influence of the building materials. And even some good building materials or junctions may fail because the heating exposure is so high that even a somewhat, maybe it's not perfectly installed or just bad luck, then fails. At 10 feet, it's very hard at high winds to see big differences with the materials. It becomes such an incredible load. Now, another caution is, of course, in a real event, you're dealing with structures that winds aren't constant. Winds are blowing this way, then that way, then this is so just because it is an 80-mile-an-hour wind event doesn't mean that 80-mile-an-hour will hit when your house is being exposed from another structure. And so your minimal work may pay dividends because it was a small fire exposure at that time and you survived, and then an hour later the next one has a lot of hardening, but it's 80-mile-an-hour winds with 20-foot separation and it just can't stand up to it. So there's some luck. I mean, that's why we have probabilities, right? You never know the exact what will happen. But I do think, if we're talking about really having, we're trying to get towards zero spread, we're talking in the 30-40 foot range. And the closer we go, the more important hardening is. Now, I don't want to say that having them close together means all houses will instantly be lost. It just starts meaning that all your risk is tied together. So one loss then means the whole block. And so that's it doesn't fare well in a risk sense, but it doesn't mean that all is lost, because you still can try to prevent that whole block from igniting.
I mean, you bring the winds, and I wonder, the wind speed seems to be really important in the LA fires, as if hardening and vegetation management and so on is useful. It's meaningful at modest to low wind speeds, and then it almost doesn't matter at high wind speeds. Is that correct? And if so, what does it mean for your research? I mean, I didn't see wind speed in that bar chart.
Right, because I don't think there is a single fire where there wasn't a high wind speed, right? All of those fires were wind driven. Some were not as much. A campfire maybe was not as high winds during the exposure, but it was surrounded by conifer forest. So the exposure is going to be high for different reasons. An issue, of course, is that we never know what the wind was at the time something was exposed. So we can get some estimate of the fire exposure from the model, but still, we really don't know what was happening. If you go back and look at videos of the fires, you see major flames moving through, and other communities where it's just like little dabs of embers, and it's so very locally dependent, and we have such poor data during a fire event to extract this. So even in a very high wind event, that doesn't mean that all structures are exposed to those dramatically high winds. And that's something we have to break out. I think that the idea of saying, well, if it's at this high exposure, all is lost is I think there's a little kind of admitting defeat there. I do think that fire suppression stops being so effective at that point, but everything that we have to do still plays a role. We have to remove receptive fuels. The fuel shifts from the wildland vegetation to structures. If it is just really difficult and we remove 99% of the ways the structures can ignite, even at very high winds, I think we're going to have dramatically lowered losses. Not
It'd be
zero,
wonderful.
but
Right. It'd be
lower.
wonderful to see. It would be wonderful to see a model that is conditioned on wind speed. Um,
Yeah,
moving
I
on.
will say, obviously, wind speed is essential to the wild urban interface model, right? It drives the fire just like the urban, but it with the new data from IBHS, I think we'll be able to better tune those influences.
Wonderful. Here's a question from Charles. He asks, first of all, Professor Gollner, thanks for the great talk. He asks on slide 14 about fire suppression. He says, in our data set, we don't know when or where suppression was saving buildings. Can you comment on that? You've already spoken to his second point about high winds.
Yeah. Okay, so there's always a question about suppression. First off, there's no WUI models that I know that incorporate suppression. I've only recently seen, there's some post-earthquake that start to incorporate it, which is great. The studies by Alex Marangides, like in the Guajiro fire in San Diego, show that having a firefighter present there is the strongest correlation with survival, right? And you can only get that not from this DINS data analysis, which is, I'd say, population level, but from a very careful, on-the-ground 2-year investigation, like happened in the Camp Fire, happened in Guajiro, the Waldo Canyon. There's a limited number of events where they did that. There's confounding variables. You are not going to defend something that is undefendable and unsafe. So you're already biasing the results by going to areas where you can. And the other thing is, I think suppression can have a big impact because so many ignitions are embers jumping the street. You can't do anything across the street, but if you can put out the embers, you prevent it from crossing the street and you have a dramatic save. Once a house ignites and burns, not as much. Look at how many engines it takes on a single burning structure. You're talking about at least 2, maybe? And the water supply, there isn't enough to do that kind of conflagration fight. So at some point, it becomes completely ineffective, but it can matter a lot at early stages. Why don't we include it at all, besides the fact that the data doesn't exist, is because these were really fast fires, which is the new term out, right? So there was a great paper from CU Boulder that came out, right, looking at fast fires. And obviously, all of these WUI fires spread fast. People didn't expect them, and everything was focused on life safety. So there are cases, I'm sure, where there is some limited suppression, but for the most part, there was not a lot of suppression that changed the outcome, right? There could be little houses and some things here and there, but for the most part, many of these were large fires that burned through, going back, they burned through communities. So suppression was not playing a big impact. The Eden fire, everyone was running for the hills. The Camp Fire, it was really evacuation focused. Going back to the Tubbs fire, very early on, they said our focus is life safety. You need to get out of there. So structure protection, it's not that it wasn't at all in any, but it was not a dominating feature. And so that's why it's okay for these particular fires. Other fires, it would be great to include suppression effects in the future if we actually had that data, or to even test the influence of that.
Yeah, that would be super interesting. I visited the Jasper fire ground a few times after the fire last year, and saw what looked like effective. I don't know what you call it, where sprinklers are running. There was one house in particular that was super well protected. It had a 5,000 gallon tank, and it had sprinklers that were, intended for fire suppression all the way around the house and on the roof and blah blah blah. And you saw fire lines along one side of town with agricultural sprinklers hooked up to a great big tank and whatnot. It would be, I'd be curious to know whether you're is that on your research agenda? Have other people dealt with the efficacy of sprinklers? Could you speak to that?
Yeah, what a can of worms. It's a very difficult topic because it's very limited in terms of data. Uh, it's been a number of years, I think 2017 when we wrote a review paper, and the literature at that time had maybe only 3 or 4 case studies, one of which was a fire ripped through, burned down the houses. It was somewhere around the Great Lakes in the US. And then afterwards, they installed a bunch of sprinklers connected to lakes, and a fire ripped through again a number of years later, and it did way better.
Mm.
But of course, a lot of the fuel burns, so it's a completely different condition, and it's completely
Mm.
biased. Different fire conditions. There are reports of structures surviving, and
Mhm.
others of them not. And I know companies have released data that the sprinklers have been very effective in the LA fires and how many survived. How much was the sprinkler effectiveness? How much was the fact that they did vents and this and that? Or was there an active person there? I think that when we talk about embers, if you're actually getting water on the embers, there's a potential for that to have a big benefit, right? You don't knock out every mode. You're not going to prevent ignition from your neighbor with sprinklers. The heat is far too great. But you could put out embers, so long as that water actually gets everywhere it needs to be under 80-mile-an-hour wind gusts. How do you achieve that? Well, that needs testing, that needs work, and I don't know. A lot of that just isn't out in the public sphere. If you look in a building, NFPA 13 has very prescriptive codes for in structure sprinklers. They have been tested extensively, especially at UL and other labs, and there are very clear guidelines on how they work, what they do, when they need to turn on, how much supply, etc. Nothing exists for the exterior. And so I'm really nervous about promoting anything until that work is done. I think there's potential. I mean, I think we agree the potential to put out embers is a great idea, so long as it's not affecting the water supply, it's not endangering someone getting there. But how it's done, if you sprinkle one side and the wind blows so much it leaves the other vulnerable, it may not matter. So I'd still say do the hardening that's been proven first and think of that as only icing on the cake. We just don't know the efficacy. We don't know how much is actually it makes an impact and how much is just a secondary thing. We don't know yet.
And to find that out, do we rely entirely on experiment, like the IBHS experiments you illustrated before? Can we do some of that by physics-based modeling? Could some combination of the two tell us more about the efficacy of sprinklers?
I think a combination certainly could. I think probably IBHS is the only facility that I'm aware of that operates the scale that you could test these things. And probably insurance would like to know their efficacy. So that is something to think about in the future. But, I'll be honest, I've only know how much heat comes off a building as they're spreading under wind based on experiments finished this year. It's been a long time coming. My first NFPA, well, they're all combined now. But anyways, the NFPA Standard Committee for Wildland, in 2014, I was like, well, wait, how are you giving reduced structure separation for interior sprinklers? They're not required in the attic. That won't actually protect a building if an ember enters an attic. How can you? And it's only now sort of changing. But I remember what they said is, well, until you have structure separation data, like what is the right distance? Until you do the tests, how can we change something? This was a real learning experience for me. And now in 2024, we're seeing the data come out. It's in the process. It's going to be published. Some of it's under review. This is fabulous to see us advance to this level, and I hope it keeps coming. But yeah, I hope more groups come together. I've talked to some of those companies, and I feel like there, at least from some, there is a willingness to support that kind of testing. But there's really limited facilities, there's limited scale, and it's sometimes difficult to know exactly what we're testing for. And I see a similar issue with fire retardants on exterior of structures. There's no testing standard. There's a lot of misinformation. Some things may work well for certain cases, but what's advertised is all over the place. So it's an industry in need of more openness and information and standardization.
Great. Andrew Foote asks for some basic documentation. He says, do you have a document that walks through the definition of hardening and what specifically would be recommended? Would you point him to California Building Code Chapter 7 or something? What would you suggest?
Yeah, hardening. I think what we were focused on, of course, is from California Building Code Chapter 7A, which is available publicly. There's also, if you just go for CAL FIRE and look for hardening, they lay out what they expect, what is in that standard, what they expect on their websites, both from the defensible space side and from the hardening side. IBHS does a similar. They have somewhat slightly tweaked for their IBHS wildfire prepared home, but they're both fantastic resources.
Yeah, absolutely. An anonymous attendee asks, still on slide 23, can mitigation measures immediately before a fire, like what companies like Wildfire Defense Systems does, achieve comparable? I guess you've sort of addressed this question I think this is
so this is like
sprinklers.
The strategic immediate mitigation. Yeah. I think we don't know the impact of those on-site firefighting efforts. I think we don't know. I will say that before the Zone 0, they asked me to give like a review to the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection on the Zone 0 proposal, and I did speak to a number of firefighters and fire investigators. And what they say is that, hey, when I see fire coming, the first thing I triage is remove flammable material, wet things down, make sure anything I can see is sealed. And so, of course, they will remove indiscriminately, right? They will just come with a chainsaw and they'll move everything away that they think could possibly light on fire. They're not seeing what the state of the bush or how much this is watered or that. And so I do think some of this is taking a broad brush, but I think it depends on the vulnerabilities, but it might play an influence. There is data from Waldo Canyon. I believe there are reports in Alex Marangitti's report from NIST that the firefighters realized fences were drawing flames up to structures, and then they started smashing them and pulling them away from the buildings before it got to further neighborhoods. So that's a data point that there's some measures that are effective. What they actually do, how effective that is, I don't know. Do they spray something on? I don't know. There's no data on that. But having people there potentially. I think the biggest issue with people going there is more of an operations issue in terms of safety. If you're having people operating in the field that are not directly under control by the incident commander, is that creating a scenario where incident commanders may need to then devote resources and risk their lives to save other people if there's entrapments or things? That's where things become questionable, but that's not what I studied, but that should be looked at. And it may turn out that some things are helpful and maybe some others are not. I know that they're in California, they're talking about volunteer brigades doing similar actions. So these are very much, becoming an issue and should be looked at.
Cool. Tracy Whelan asks, how are you thinking about the role of extreme downslope winds in your models, especially in the context that many traditional wildfire models are using lower resolution, more generalized wind data? So there's wind there, and I think that there's a sort of note of topography as well.
Yes.
That little diagram you showed was a sort of Euclidean plane and didn't have slopes in it. Did you?
No. I mean, any of
tell
these.
us about that.
Yeah. So So any of these models are run similar to how you'd see Farsight, right? Except it's just using an Eulerian level set method rather than Huygens principle to spread the fire in wildland. So the vegetation gives one of the 40 fuel models from Scott and Bergen. The weather is often derived from forecasts. Actually, we are revising a paper looking at changes in weather inputs for a model. Obviously, Weather and wind is one of, if not the most dominant variables.
Hmm.
And these extreme downslope winds are very important. And it's interesting, sometimes some sources give better predictions in some areas and other sources in other areas, right? So that's hard. It's easier when you're reconstructing a fire because you can pick the best source that matches the ground data the best. Or when you don't match the source, you can run a higher resolution WRF model and try to predict those downslope winds. So, in reconstruction of the LA fires, we have had that problem. None of the existing public data did a good prediction of the downslope winds, and it required finer scale modeling to give those inputs. This is not a coupled model because this is designed to run stochastically and fast over many scenarios. So yeah, the downslope winds are very important. I think for the majority of these fires, the existing like high rapid refresh rate, the HRRR outputs were fairly decent for input winds. Wind Ninja and downscaling winds didn't make too much difference. It could make a little bit depending on where you are. Other times it kind of messed up the flow. But I would say in LA was an exception where fine scale modeling of downslope winds was very important.
Scott Ritter asks, in the plant test, would the amount of heat flux required to ignite the wet plants, or perhaps even dry, have ignited a realistic structure, regardless of the additional contribution once the plant ignites?
It's not clear if that would ignite a structure. The heat fluxes from the pallets were on the order of what was, so that, somewhere between just under 30 kilowatts per meter squared was what we were aiming for, and that is what was received from a 10-foot separation. That for that amount of time would not necessarily ignite some Chapter 7A buildings, but it might ignite cedar shingle siding, So this was a higher heat flux scenario. We obviously only got to choose one condition and then this is obviously one repetition, but we did 4 of each. Limited time, limited resources, we chose what we could. But for me, it gives great large-scale data that we can now take into the lab. And yeah.
Awesome. Alexander Popovich asks, I have a question about slide 23. What would be the best way to interpret it in terms of mitigation from just moving out of WUI zones?
So that's not mitigation.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's no house there, then the house doesn't burn down.
Right.
I mean, moving out and leaving the house is probably going to add more risk. It's not tended and taken care of. Yeah, so I don't think this can be compared to that sort of, retreat mentality or that retreat idea. Again, this is not for building a new community, right? If you were to build a new community with, let's say, 30-foot separation and, watered areas and concrete and large separations and stucco walls and everything built to the absolute peak, that could be a very hard community to ignite, and the few additions you get could be handled by the fire service. It's very different to changing a community. You're not going to go through and change the siding on every house,
Right.
So I think what you can achieve in a new construction is far, far higher than what you can achieve by hardening existing construction. However, you still can do a lot on existing. And what existing will depend, because if you do things for this whole area, the fire will slow down as it spreads through. And that may also have additional benefits, but you don't know until you test.
Wonderful. My ICLR colleague, Glenn McGillivray, asks or points out there's some research that well-managed, well-chosen ornamental vegetation can actually keep embers off of homes. And he cites a document from an article from The Conversation. He asked for thoughts, and Ann Cope, who's also here from IBHS, has several comments about that article. So I'll ask you to respond to the that issue. And maybe if Anne wants to add something in the Q&A, I'll read that.
Yeah, I'm very aware of the article, and man, it's been, yeah, Zone Zero became such a heated thing, and it's challenging because, right, the data we have is very clear that clearing everything has a big impact. And then it says, well, what if we just partially do it? What if we partially do that? Well, now there's two maybe scenarios, one at IDHS and one of ours that have been tested, but it's still very limited. I am not aware of any evidence of plants having any protective quality in terms of embers or the ember catcher. This was mentioned in some articles. I think Alexander Seifert said maybe, because I think that was based on some of the geospatial data. Maybe that's a potential effect. Our test did not focus on embers at all, so I have no ember data. So I think on one of the IBHS experiments that I watched on plants, I think that was also shown to the Board of Forestry, an ember ignited, and it wasn't very dry. It was still watered, but not like super watered like ours. An ember ignited the base and then took the plant. And so, I don't think that there's going to be a protective benefit from the plants on embers. I think having hardy board on the side of the structure, that's going to have a dramatic impact, and preventing embers from getting in there. I think that hardening is going to have the biggest on embers. I would say for the heat flux, we see, there is a period of reduced heating in the thickness of the plant, not at the eaves, because remember, heat's accumulating at the top and wind is blowing. And this is only 15 miles an hour. It will be more extreme at higher wind speeds. But that effect is removed, and then you get 60 kilowatt per meter square peaks after the plants ignite. They don't ignite as extremely as the dry plants. But even this is a brand new plant with no dead material. It's completely blocked from embers, and it doesn't add safety to the overall picture, even though it's far better than having the dry vegetation. But I'm not aware of an ember impact. I think embers, they can any small niche that you have receptive, ember will find a way to get in there and ignite it. And so having any plants that have any material, it just leaves up for that to accumulate at the base or for something to happen. So even if an ember falls off the plant all the time, I think that's actually worse, because now you have a pile there.
An anonymous attendee asks, if you were crafting mitigation grant eligibility, what would be the top 6 things that you'd make eligible? And the commenter speculates that those might be fire-resistant exterior siding and roofing, installation of vent screens, moving and eliminating vegetation, fire-resistant window panes, and fire-resistant eaves or enclosed eaves, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, these are all great things. And I think a lot of it so much depends on the particular community and the particular exposure, right? Is this house expected to have exposure from a wildfire? Does it have a big separation? Is it a ranch? Or does that house going to get exposed from its neighbor? And then you're talking more about really protecting the walls in between and the vegetation and everything in between those structures. There's a lot of nuance. In a broad sense, man, if you still have cedar wood shake roofs, please put Class A roofs on, please. And I would say that vents is always the next thing I say, because it's just so cheap. It's so easy. I mean, you can do this for $50 and you can get vents, and I mean, it's not pretty, but you can do it more expensively and get better ones. But fine mesh over vents and sealing every nook and crack is a very cheap and homeowner possible move. Going from there, you're right. The siding, potentially windows tend to get expensive, and so that's cautious. Also, windows are more important when they're going to be directly exposed from flame. So you can remove your vegetation. You may not want to, but you can. That's cheaper. But if you have a nearby structure or shed or something, then you have to worry about hardening that and hardening you, removing the fences within those 5 feet. I mean, I think everything getting the fire away, and then making the wall non-flammable and the eaves non-flammable after the roof is key. But it depends on this particular makeup. I can't find a lot of data on wood shingle siding either. There's not a whole lot of testing. We've wanted to add some more, but I think because we know it's so vulnerable on the roof, it's probably pretty vulnerable on the side. I mean, obviously we know radiative ignition testing, but not like full scale, because I think it's already been discounted that it's not a good idea.
Okay. An anonymous attendee wants to talk a little bit about insurance and risk transfer here. So the commenter says self-mitigation is key, but climate change risks seem to be increasing at an increasing rate in severity and frequency. In California's case specifically, it seems like the insurance industry is met with too much regulatory red tape. Perhaps a parametric insurance product would be a good option for those that are hardening their homes and lowering their risks. Do you ever think about risk transfer? Do you have any opinions about risk transfer?
You know, I am not qualified to say one insurance product or approach is better than another. I've been a big proponent on all of the committees that we've looked at trying to better our information. I think more knowledge about actual fine scale risks and the way we do modeling and the way we interpret it will help us make better decisions. But the way to fix the insurance crisis is a can of worms. I would say that there's a lot of tech development coming out. We see a lot of startups, and they're starting to do things like having insurance products in the non-admitted market, especially for higher value properties, doing all sorts of interesting things. Because a lot of people in California move to insurance of last resort, which is the California Fair Plan, and it's a big problem. So I don't think I have a recommendation other than, you know, it should be all hands on deck, and in just trying to get all of these products to have better information, and anything we can do to reduce risk community-wide is where we're going to have the benefit. It's not about your home. Unless you live, you know, ranch style, you're fairly far from other people. It's almost always coupled risk with your neighbors. And if you can do that kind of work together, that's where you're going to really have big impacts. And I hope we'll see more insurance and government and community partnerships to encourage that in whatever form it comes. So I'm not an insurance person, so yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. I have one last comment, and then I'm going to ask you for final words. Stephanie Uil says, just wanted to say Mossy Cho for this, and that means thank you very much in an Indigenous Canadian language. I want to, before I ask you for last words, I want to remind everybody that our next month's webinar on our next Friday Forum is ICLR's Director of Research, Dan Sandink, who's going to be briefing us on the outcome of Resilient Homes Task Force. That's December 12th, 2025. Michael, do you have any final last words, some big takeaway that you want to give us before we conclude today?
You know, I just want to say first, thank you for all attending and interest in the topic. This is, you know, well, first off, I want to say, you know, this is I think where so much is growing, right? We know what's vulnerable in the WUI, and we know where the fire can ignite things, but we don't actually have the ability to quantify it because there's so many factors at the same time. And I don't think we're there. We don't have everything, but we're moving in that direction. We're making good strides. There are at least two other, you know, public models, not necessarily coupled with wildfire completely yet. They're, you know, but these are coming together, and I hope that this community will grow, and I hope that data will show and take a lot of, because the things that we're doing now, you know, I learned some of it exists in black boxes behind closed doors, and we don't know how they're operating. And the more we can openly advance these techniques, the data and the modeling, the black boxes will improve too. And I think hopefully this will be a path out of some of, as well as mentioned, this insurance crisis, at least in California, so that we can better quantify effects, better understand our risk, and better mitigate it so we can lower those costs effectively. Rather than just paying more premiums, let's put the money in mitigation and actually know. And so things that move that direction, I think data is part of it. And then you all need to come up with great solutions to get it on the ground.
Awesome. Well, Professor Michael Gollner, thank you so much for being with us today. I very much enjoyed our conversation, and I hope we can find a way to collaborate in the future. Thanks everybody for attending, and I hope to see you next month with Dan Sandink's talk. Bye-bye, everyone.